Realism from 11.9 to 9.11. So, in this week's module, you read about the phenomenon of how realism not only interprets world events, but as a theory has also helped provide a structure for decision making in this period of time. And to review very quickly, the 11.9 simply refers to the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, to 9/11 obviously being the terrorist attacks on American soil on September 11, 2001. And so what we'll do is try to use this as a moment to examine how foreign policy is influenced by certain schools of thought. And while these schools of thought, these perspectives, are helpful in assembling pictures of the international relations, they also help to drive and influence events. They can by allowing people, when they use these perspectives, they will make decisions based on their interpretation of current events. So realists will be worried about power, as we've seen. Liberals will be worried about repeated interactions and multilateralism. And identity perspectives will look at, some cases, individual actors, and also how nations identify themselves in that role of those identities in driving world events. So, in this case, we are examining realism, and it's really important because realists have had a great deal of influence over American foreign policy in two key moments. And the first is the fall of the Berlin Wall, the fall of the Soviet Union. So 11.9. And so what does the fall of the Soviet Union mean for the United States in terms of international relations is one of the key questions here. And so very quickly, you are made aware that with the fall of the collapse of the Soviet Union and being the centerpiece of that system of countries that also orbited the Soviet Union, just as a series of countries had orbited the West, the United States and Europe. This also means that the United States is left as the sole superpower after the war. There is no hot war in, the Cold War never turns hot. And so there are proxy wars fought, as we saw with Korea and Vietnam, for example, but what we don't get is a hot war between the United States and the Soviet Union and their allies. But with the collapse of the Soviet Union, what's left is the United States is now the lone superpower left, which leaves a situation known as unipolarity. So if the Cold War was a bipolar world where you had two superpowers, the United States versus the Soviet Union, now being down to one superpower, this also creates a very interesting problem for the United States. So if a number of American decisions, foreign policy and international relations decisions, had been made in the context of the Cold War, so for example, should the United States support a particular government or regime, even if in identity cases this regime did not support democracy as the United States would prefer or anything of that nature, what happens? Well, the United States now has to reassess its relationships with a bunch of governments, but also you wonder, what does this mean for the security of the United States? And what we see is that we also don't know what this does to the world system necessarily, especially those states that had been part of the Soviet Union that are now independent. So, for example, countries like Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, Georgia, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, these all had been part of the Soviet republics, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Russia was simply one republic, the largest one. But now you have a number of these countries. Russia's in charge of the former Soviet military and the nuclear arsenal. But that Russian government is new, it's weak, there are multiple economic, political problems, structural problems, social problems, and the question is that a lot of American policymakers are asking is, what does this mean for the United States? Does this create a new anarchy in the world system? And doesn't that mean that the United States is the hegemon of world power? In other words, we have a United Nations, or we have a world system, and the United States, by virtue of being the last superpower left standing, would basically be the country calling the shots in this new world system by virtue of its power. Which brings us to the question, a secondary question, unipolarity and its advantages and disadvantages. So far as I've made it sounds like unipolarity is quite an advantage, because it continues to allow the United States to secure American power, right? So if the United States is the last superpower remaining, it's unipolar and it's a hegemon, right? It's that leader of the group. It has the financial resources, the political resources, and the military resources to secure its interests better than any other one country. So unipolarity would mean that the United States is in the best and strongest position to secure its interests. The disadvantage to that, however, is that it doesn't mean the United States is invulnerable. As technology increases, it also leaves the United States vulnerable to asymmetric warfare and attacks. So smaller powers in rogue states, as well as organizations, can target the United States using newer technology to cause great damage. And that's sort of what bookends this experience, and that's the terrorist attacks on 9/11. At the same time, preserving hegemony is historically very difficult and ultimately unsustainable. Find a world power or a country throughout world history that continued to hold on to hegemony over the world group for a sustained period of time. And it'd be hard to do. You just can't do it. Athens had been a hegemon, Sparta had been a hegemon, and both of those classical empires fell. So being a hegemon, on the one hand, is great while you're on top, but that point on the top of the pyramid is short-lived. And so the question becomes, is this ultimately a good idea? And so there, you get some division among realists who would say that the ability of the United States to have the greatest amount of material assets, to have the greatest access and ability to exert power, to secure its interests, all of these things, realists would value, would say are great. The question becomes, how does this influence or impact the United States and its interest? And does this or does this not lead to basically a new kind of security dilemma? And how does it relate to warfare? So that leaves us still the question, what to do about the Soviet Union? And what question I didn't ask in the last slide, which was, what would be a good outcome for the people of the former Soviet Union? I didn't ask that question, because from this perspective, that's a secondary question. The primary question is, what's in the best interest of the United States if you're an American realist? So, what would be a good outcome for the people of the United States, and how do we maybe find a scenario that's beneficial to both? The end of the Cold War makes a wedge in realism, or at least opens it up publicly. And so you have a realist dispute that lasts into the present between one group who identify as what we would call power balancing realists, and another group who consider themselves what we would call power transition realists. And the division between these two is very important to understand in terms of getting to the heart of modern realist perspective. So, what do we do about understanding realism? First, remembering where they agree. So on the basics of realism, both power balancing and power transition realists will agree that their key interest is power and access to it. And so they believe that the real motives of countries and international relations is power, access to power, and the exertion of power in the interest of securing the rational self-interest of the countries at hand. They also both agree on the importance of material capabilities. So that when one examines the material capabilities of different countries, that a country that has way more material capabilities than others, that it tends to encourage one country to treat the other in a different way, perhaps invade it historically, or treat it as a subordinate. Both sides will agree in the danger presented by anarchy in the world system, and that it's better to have a more ordered world, meaning one that you understand and control. And they also believe in the problems posed by security dilemmas. Where they tend to disagree is in terms of war and the balance of power. And that is, we're going to find that power balancing realists and power transition realists will find or disagree on what tends to cause wars, and that the balance of power is something they disagree on, because one group will want to balance power ideally, and another group will want to not balance power and keep it imbalanced. So in a unipolar system, power is inherently imbalanced. In a multipolar system, power is more balanced. And so we'll see those differences in a moment.